Immortal Redneck is what happens when you take Serious Sam, Rogue Legacy, Ziggurat, and Redneck Rampage and throw it all into one game. It's a procedurally generated, roguelike first-person shooter where you play as a mummified redneck who has to fight his way through 3 different pyramids. By making kills, earning gold, and spending them on skills in a literal skill tree, you'll eventually become strong enough to conquer everything the game can throw at you and defeat the enemies within each pyramid. It all sounds pretty good, and it mostly is. Now look, first things first, I really like Immortal Redneck. It's got a charming art style, a likable protagonist with a filthy mouth and a good sense of humor, and it's got really enjoyable and slick shooting controls. But it's the kind of game I can't really see myself having the patience to finish, at least not in the near future, for reasons I'll get into in the video, but basically because just like Rogue Legacy, it's a game where death is a necessary aspect of the gameplay. I've been playing now for 8 hours, and in that time I still haven't even been able to beat the boss for the first pyramid, and I've probably only even been able to progress far enough to fight him maybe half a dozen times as well. So I'm not even sure if I'd call this a full review. Instead, I think it's probably more of an impressions video because I don't think it's fully right reviewing something if you haven't fully completed it. And the reason I haven't completed it is because it's become abundantly clear that this isn't a game with an 8 to 10 hour long campaign. I'm not even sure if you could finish it in 15 to 20 hours either. You don't just shoot your way through every pyramid and then watch the ending credits. No, you're gonna die a lot, and that's really the core mechanic to the game. You play for a bit, you earn a bit of gold, you eventually get killed, then you spend your gold on upgrading your redneck before doing it all over again. And if that already doesn't sound like fun to you, then just stop watching, because I don't think anything else I'm gonna say is gonna win you over. But first, let's talk about the positives. So in the game's opening, we see our character, simply known as the Redneck, captured and turned into a mummy for some reason. From this point, you're dropped into the first pyramid and sent off on your merry way to figure out what's going on. Initially, you start off as the Redneck with a pistol, shotgun, and a bundle of dynamite, but you'll quickly begin unlocking new classes and weapons to play with. All up, there's 9 classes in the game, what are referred to as favors, where you take on attributes of a certain god or goddess and get unique weapons with an active and passive ability. For instance, there's the God of Strength, who starts with an Uzi, revolver, minigun, and a grenade launcher with the ability to turn invincible for a few seconds. Another one is the Goddess of Mining, yes, believe it or not, who earns more gold from gold pickups, making it useful if you're trying to grind for gold. And her ability is to fire out a kind of grappling hook to make navigation quicker. Apart from that, they all play out the same in the sense that you're just going from one randomly generated room to the next, killing all the enemies before heading to the next room and doing it again. After you find a staircase, you ascend to the next floor with a boss fight ensuing on the 3rd and 7th floor. Now, I'm not lying when I say that Immortal Redneck has some of the smoothest controls I've seen in a shooting game in recent memory. It's similar to how Doom 4 controlled, where you can quickly grapple up ledges, there's infinite sprinting, and the player speed, regardless of the class you're playing as, can be blisteringly fast. Compared to a lot of other roguelike shooters which feature decidedly flat layouts, Immortal Redneck is a lot more vertical, with certain rooms having multiple levels requiring a bit of platforming to get around them. I generally dislike these kind of procedurally generated games, mostly because I find the repetition of environments kinda lazy, but in Immortal Redneck they're constructed a lot better than what you get in similar games. They're more like mini arenas than just random rooms with layouts that often don't serve a purpose. There's a whole heap of weapons to use as well. There's pistols, shotguns, rocket and grenade launchers, a potato gun, Tesla rifle, electric flamethrower, and a few mystical weapons as well. All of which can be swapped out for weapons you pick up during the game. And look, in that regard, the shooting is great old-fashioned projectile-based enemies, and as long as you're not a complete idiot, you can easily avoid most incoming damage. Overall, it just feels and plays incredibly smoothly and fluidly, and it's just a joy to control. Initially, the game has a steep learning curve too, but an enjoyable one. You'll fall prey to various traps, you'll stumble into pits of lava, and certain enemy types are gonna kick your ass until you learn and adapt to their patterns. There's a real sense of accomplishment and enjoyment to overcoming and avoiding your past mistakes, which I think is what makes this game so addictive. But the major dilemma with Immortal Redneck is its RNG aspect. Now, I'd say about 30% of how well you do in this game comes down to your actual skill level. Another 30% comes down to your stats, whether or not you've upgraded your health, defense, damage, and so forth, and the last remaining percentage comes down to the RNG for that particular run you're on. Your stats become more and more important the further you get into the game, and if you don't have enough health or defense points for the floor you're currently on, it often becomes almost impossible to survive. Because you're going from fighting enemies who take off 5 or 10 health points to enemies who can suddenly take off like 50 or 60. As a result, success in this game sadly comes from playing it over and over, hoarding up your gold coins, incrementally upgrading stats one at a time. Collecting scrolls along the way is left up to the player, as some of these have positive effects, but a lot of them have negative effects as well. Like, you might get some that can increase your movement speed, the amount of gold you can collect, lower enemies' health, or allow you to see enemies through walls. Now, these are all good, but then some of the scrolls the game throws at you are like instant run enders. And it's incredibly unfun to be having a really good run, only for the game to deal you a shitty hand and essentially handicap you to the extent where there's no point to even playing anymore. Some of the worst scrolls you can get include one that replaces all of the text in the game with unreadable hieroglyphics. Well, unreadable unless you understand how to read hieroglyphics, I guess. Another one might be the ability to only carry a single weapon, which massively gimps your capabilities during combat, or something equally annoying like removing the weapon's crosshair. By far the worst one is the one that replaces all of the gold dropped by enemies, gold basically being XP, with useless chunks of meat. This one I think objectively is a deal breaker, as you always need gold to progress in the game, so once they've taken away the most basic mechanic with this stupid power up, I just don't see the point of playing from then on. Whenever I pick this one up, I just jump into a pool of lava or let enemies kill me. Now look, I can kind of understand negative scrolls if they make the game more challenging, but if it's quite literally just going to make a run completely redundant, I think it removes the entire point of them. And these scrolls are really just down to blind luck. You've got no control over what scrolls the game gives you, and sometimes you'll get 5 really good ones back to back, and then yeah, other times you'll get 5 horrible ones. I had this one run where I was doing really well. I had around 8,000 gold and some really good weapons. Then I got a scroll that took away half of my gold. Then the next one after that replaced all of my weapons with random crappier ones. The icing on the cake was the next scroll that removed the ability for me to reload weapons. Goody. I guess my point is that this is what you're dealing with constantly in this game. It's like a tug of war between a good outcome and a horrible one that can often ruin the experience, and you largely have no control over any of it. You're not even able to choose a god's favour each playthrough. The game will pick from 2 that you've unlocked and allow you to pick either. Again, similar to how Rogue Legacy would often give you a limited selection with each new run as well. For a game that's got such an old school feel to the shooting and movement, they've added in other elements to the gunplay that just feel out of place. Reloading times, for instance, are extremely slow, and you can't even swap out weapons during a reload animation, which is just stupid. Having multiple weapons you can switch to when a weapon runs dry is pretty much the whole reason you've got multiple weapons, so to not be able to switch to something else as a fallback just leaves you as a sitting duck. This seems to have been a conscious design choice too, because there's a scroll that lets you cancel out the reload animation to switch weapons, but this really should be a base mechanic. Another weird addition with the shooting is how inaccurate weapons are from a distance, to the point where you can't even hit anything. What's doubly annoying is that the range doesn't affect the enemies, who can still fire projectiles at you from the other side of a room. Certain enemies can accurately lob projectiles at you when you're not even in their line of sight, which is just horse shit. Some enemy types also fire trajectory projectiles, if that makes sense. Like, most projectiles go to the position you were standing when they were fired, but trajectory projectiles go to the position you're heading. So if you're circle strafing, for instance, then the projectile's going to be fired ahead of your current position to hit you where you're going. I don't know if that makes sense, but my point is that it's not a very fair way of attacking the player, and it removes the effectiveness of circle strafing. The boss fights have clear-cut strategies for defeating them, at least they do out of the 2 I went up against, but even still you'll usually take a fair few hits, which is where your stats are going to come into play. Not to mention too, if you don't have the right weapons for the bosses, it also makes them harder than they need to be, or in some instances, next to impossible, and again, this is something that is often out of the player's control. Honestly, in that sense, the whole thing feels like an early access game. I don't mean that as an insult, because the game's really refined in terms of how it looks and controls, but it's chock full of balancing issues that become really evident and annoying when you start sinking some serious hours into the game. And like I said, it's the kind of thing you'd see in an early access game before the devs kind of patch it and balance it all out. Despite all of this, I still have an absolute blast playing this game, and honestly, every time I die, all I want to do is get right back in and keep on playing, which I think, regardless of the issues with the gameplay, speaks volumes about how enjoyable the whole thing is. I think ultimately I would recommend Immortal Redneck, but with a stipulation. I mean, this is not a wham bam thank you ma'am kind of game. You will spend hours and hours just trying to get your health and damage output to a point where you can actually stand your ground, and even then, once you get to the next floor or pyramid, you're going to be right back at square one and have to do it all over again. Immortal Redneck demands quite a lot from the player in that sense, and if the thought of the game punishing you over and over until you scrape your stats up to a point where you can manage doesn't sound like your cup of tea, then this game isn't for you. But it looks good, it sounds good, and it controls amazingly well, and as I said, it's enjoyable for the most part. If you've got no issues with the grinding mechanic of the game, then I'd say definitely pick this one up. And I think in terms of other shooting games available at the moment, this is hands down one of the better ones, especially at this price point.
Alright ladies, show's over.